Before we begin, let's slow everything down for a moment. This story is not meant to rush anywhere. It is about survival, silence, and people who lived far away from noise. It is about a winter, but also about patience. So take a breath, settle into a comfortable spot, and let the day quietly step aside. You are welcome here. This is a bedtime documentary, a calm walk into the past where the world moved slower and the nights were much darker. In the 1830s, the American wilderness was not something you visited for adventure. It was something you entered carefully, knowing it could change you. There were no roads cutting straight lines through the land. No signs telling you where to turn. Just open space that did not explain itself to anyone. Mountains stretched across the horizon, standing tall and quiet. They did not try to impress. They had been there long before anyone thought of naming them. Rivers flowed cold and steady through valleys, moving at their own pace, carrying ice in winter and stories in silence. Forests stood thick and deep, filled with tall trees that blocked sound, light, and sometimes even direction. This world was slow. Morning came gently when the sun felt like it. Night arrived early and stayed long without apology. Darkness was not dramatic. It was normal. Silence lived everywhere, not empty silence, but full silence. The kind filled with wind through branches, distant water under ice, and the soft crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. And in this quiet world lived a small group of men who chose distance over comfort. They were known as mountain men. Mountain men were not famous. Most people back east never knew their names. They were not chasing glory, and they were not trying to be brave. Many of them simply ended up here. Some had left towns that felt too crowded. Some had walked away from families they could not fix. And some just wanted to be alone, truly alone, without anyone asking questions. They lived for long periods without seeing another human face. Sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Their homes were simple, a small shelter made of logs or stone, a fire that had to be protected like a living thing, and the sky above them, always present, always watching. They trapped animals for fur, which they traded when they returned to civilization, but the wilderness was not their job. It was their entire life. They woke up cold. They went to sleep cold. And in between, they moved carefully because mistakes out there were expensive. If your boots failed, your feet suffered. If your fire died, the night felt endless. And if you ignored the weather corrected you quickly. Still, before this winter, there was balance. Cold winters were expected. Snow was normal. Ice came and went. Mountain men knew how to live with these things. They dressed in layers of buckskin and fur, learned through trial and error, not advice. They knew which valleys trapped cold air and which ridges caught the sun. They learned when to move and when staying still was the smartest option. They trusted routine. Morning meant checking traps. Midday meant slow travel through familiar ground. Evening meant fire, food, and silence. And silence was not lonely to them. It was peaceful. When you live without crowds long enough, your thoughts slow down too. You begin to notice small things. The way smoke rises straight when the air is still. The sound snow makes when it settles. The change in your breath when the cold deepens. In the early days of 1836, The wilderness looked the same as it always had. Snow fell gently. Rivers moved more slowly. Trees stood patient under white weight. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. The land never announces change loudly. It whispers. Mountain men understood this. They watched quietly. Animals moved less. Some trails stayed empty longer than usual. The air felt sharper, even during daylight. These were not warnings, just details, and details mattered. At night, fires burned low, not because fuel was scarce, but because calm did not need much light. Stars filled the sky completely, steady and bright. A man could sit by the fire and feel completely alone, yet strangely complete. No conversations to manage, no expectations, just warmth, breath, and time. The wilderness allowed this kind of life. It demanded respect, but it offered freedom. And freedom was worth the cold fingers and stiff mornings. So life continued quietly, step by step, day by day. No one rushed. No one prepared for anything unusual. Because nothing felt unusual yet. The mountains stood still, the rivers rested, and the men who lived among them trusted that tomorrow would look much like today. The fire crackled softly. The night settled in, and silence as always remained. Life on the edge of civilization was not dramatic in the way stories often make it sound. There were no daily gunfights, no loud hero moments, and no one giving speeches to the mountains. Most days were quiet, very quiet, and that was exactly how mountain men preferred it. Civilization, such as it was in the 1830s, lived far away. Towns were small, crowded, and noisy in their own way. People talked a lot, they asked questions. They expected answers. For some men, that kind of life felt heavier than carrying a full pack through snow. So they stayed on the edge, close enough to trade when they had to, far enough to breathe freely. A mountain man's day began early, not because of discipline, but because cold had its own schedule. When the fire faded, sleep ended. There was no snooze button, just stiff fingers, slow movement, and the quiet decision to get up anyway. Morning meant checking traps. Not quickly, never quickly. Rushing was how mistakes happened. Traps were spread across valleys, near rivers, and along animal trails that only experience could recognize. Some mornings brought success. Others brought nothing at all. Both were accepted without complaint. Food was simple. Meat when there was meat. Fat when there was fat. Sometimes roots, sometimes dried berries. No recipes. No variety. Hunger made everything taste acceptable. A mountain man did not eat for pleasure. He ate to continue. Clothing was worn until it nearly became part of the body. Buckskin softened over time, shaped by movement and weather. Repairs were constant. A small tear ignored today could become a serious problem tomorrow. Out here, even your clothes had responsibilities. Life on the edge of civilization meant living without backup. There was no store if supplies ran low, no doctor if sickness came, no neighbor to borrow from. Every decision mattered more because there was no one else to fix it. Yet there was comfort in that honesty. When something went wrong, there was no mystery about why. If the fire went out, it was because it was not fed. If food ran out, it was because the land offered less. There was no blaming systems or luck, just cause and effect. Mountain men learned to respect that. They traveled light, but not careless. Every item carried had a purpose. If something did not earn its place, it was left behind. Extra weight meant extra exhaustion. Extra exhaustion meant mistakes. And mistakes were expensive. Most days passed without seeing another person. Weeks could go by with nothing but animal tracks for company. For some men, this would have felt lonely. For mountain men, it felt normal. Conversation, after all, requires energy. Silence did not. They spoke aloud sometimes, but only when it helped. Talking to oneself was not strange out here. It kept the mind steady. It reminded a man that he still existed. On the edge of civilization, time moved differently. Days were measured by light, not numbers. Seasons were felt in bones, not calendars. A man knew winter was deepening not by date, but by how quickly breath froze in the air. There were moments of fear, of course, sudden storms, thin ice, illness that lingered too long, but fear was handled quietly. Panic had no use. Calm thinking lasted longer. And then there was trade. Every so often, mountain men returned to the edges of towns or trading posts. These places felt strange, loud voices, too many faces, too many questions. They traded furs for powder, tools, and supplies, then left again as soon as possible. Civilization was useful but tiring. Back in the wilderness, the air felt cleaner. The rules were simpler. Eat, stay warm, keep moving when needed, stay still when not. Life stripped down to its basics had a certain clarity. Mountain men understood the land in a way most people never would. They knew where water stayed liquid longest, where snow drifted deep, where animals rested when weather grew harsh. This knowledge was not written. It lived in memory and instinct. And instinct was trusted. Living on the edge meant accepting uncertainty as normal. Plans changed daily. Weather ignored intentions. Some days were productive. Some days were just about surviving until night. There were no achievements to announce, no one to applaud. Survival itself was enough. At night, after food and fire, there was nothing to do but sit. To listen, wind through trees, ice cracking somewhere far away, the quiet breathing of the land. These sounds replaced conversation. They became familiar, almost comforting. The edge of civilization was not empty. It was full of lessons, full of small moments that mattered deeply because there were so few distractions. And slowly, without realizing it, men who lived this way became shaped by it. Movements grew efficient. Thoughts grew simpler. Worries that once felt heavy lost importance. Out here, the land did not care who you were before. It only cared what you did today. Life on the edge was not about bravery. It was about acceptance. Acceptance that comfort was limited, that control was partial, and that silence, when respected, could be a companion rather than an enemy. So mountain men continued their routines, one quiet day at a time, balance between civilization and wilderness, belonging fully to neither and needing very little from either. The fire burned, the land listened, and life continued steady and unremarkable, exactly the way it needed to be. The America of 1836 was a place still figuring itself out. It was not young anymore, but it was not settled either. The country stretched wide, but much of it remained unknown, even to the people who claimed it. Maps existed, but they were hopeful more than accurate. Lines were drawn where no one had truly walked, and names were given to places that did not yet feel named. Most Americans lived in small towns and rural communities. Life centered around farms, rivers, and trade routes. Days were shaped by work, not ambition. People woke early, slept early, and trusted routines that had been passed down without much debate. News traveled slowly, carried by letters and travelers who arrived weeks late with stories already growing old. Cities were few and modest by modern standards. They were busy, loud, and full of movement, but still small enough that faces became familiar quickly. For many, cities felt crowded. Too many rules, too many expectations, too many people watching. This was part of why the wilderness kept calling to those who felt restless. Beyond the settled areas, the land opened wide. Vast plains, long rivers, and mountain ranges stretched beyond what most people would ever see. These places were not empty, though they were often described that way. Native tribes lived, moved, hunted, and traded across these lands, following rhythms older than the nation itself. Their presence shaped the frontier in quiet, lasting ways. The fur trade played a major role in the economy of the wilderness. Animal pelts, especially beaver, were valuable. Hats made from beaver fur were fashionable, and fashion has always had a strong pull. This demand pushed traders, trappers, and mountain men deeper into remote regions, further from the comfort of towns and closer to the unpredictability of nature. Government authority existed mostly on paper in these distant places. Laws were written far away, in buildings with warm rooms and clean desks. Out here, enforcement was rare. Order came from experience, reputation, and unspoken understanding. A man's word mattered because it had to. There were no courts nearby to argue later. Travel was slow and uncertain. Roads were rough or non-existent. Rivers served as highways when they allowed it, and obstacles when they did not. A journey that looked short on a map could take weeks. Weather decided everything. Plans were flexible by necessity. In 1836, technology was simple. Tools were made to last, not to impress. Firearms were single shot and slow to reload. Clothing was handmade or repaired endlessly. There was no easy replacement for anything that broke. This made people careful. Carefulness was a survival skill. Communication was equally slow. A man could leave a town and vanish for months without causing alarm. That was normal. Silence did not mean trouble. It just meant distance. For mountain men, this suited them well. No one expected updates. Politically, the nation was expanding. Borders were shifting. Territories were being claimed and argued over. But these big ideas felt far away in the mountains. Out there, politics did not change the weather or fill an empty stomach. The land followed its own rules, and those rules applied to everyone equally. Religion and belief played a quiet role in daily life. Many people trusted faith to explain what could not be controlled. Others trusted habit and hard work. On the frontier, belief often became personal. A man believed in what kept him alive. Despite the movement and growth, America in 1836 was still deeply tied to nature. Most people understood seasons, soil, and weather because their lives depended on them. There was no pretending that humans were separate from the land. Everyone, whether in town or far beyond it, felt winter when it arrived. For mountain men, This wider America existed at the edges of their lives. They traded with it, touched it briefly, then stepped back into silence. They were part of the nation, but not fully shaped by it. They lived between worlds, shaped more by rivers and mountains than by laws and trends. This was the America of 1836, expanding, uncertain, and still learning where its limits were. A place where progress moved slowly and nature still held the final say. The first signs of a merciless winter did not arrive with drama. There were no sudden storms, no sky tearing itself apart. Instead, the change came quietly, almost politely, as if the land did not want to disturb anyone. That is often how the hardest things begin. At first, mornings felt a little sharper than usual. The cold lingered longer after sunrise. Fingers stayed numb even after work began. Breath hung in the air a few moments more than it should have. These were small things, easy to ignore, especially for men who had lived through many winters before. Snow began to fall earlier in the season. Not heavy, not threatening, just steady. Thin layers that covered the ground and did not fully melt during the day. Normally, the land would breathe it back out. This time it held on to it. Mountain men noticed, but they did not worry. Worry wastes energy, and energy was valuable. Instead, they adjusted. Fires burned a little longer in the mornings. Camps were chosen with more care. Movements slowed slightly. These were habits, not reactions. Animals began behaving differently. Trails that were usually busy grew quiet. Herds moved sooner, passing through areas weeks ahead of their usual time. Smaller animals stayed hidden longer, conserving warmth and effort. The wilderness was shifting its posture. Experienced men paid attention to this. Animals knew things humans did not. They felt changes in air pressure, temperature, and rhythm long before people named them. When animals moved early, it meant something. Rivers started to change too. Their sound softened. The quick, playful movement of water gave way to a slower, heavier flow. Ice formed along the edges earlier than expected, thin at first, then stronger. Crossing points that were once reliable began to feel uncertain underfoot. The wind carried a different weight. It cut deeper, even on calm days. It found its way through layers of clothing, settling against skin like it had business there. At night, it moved through trees with a low, steady sound, not loud, but constant. Still, nothing felt urgent. This was the dangerous part. Mountain men were used to hard conditions. They had survived storms, hunger, and isolation before. A colder morning did not scare them. A quiet trail did not send them running. They trusted their experience, and experience had taught them patience. Days continued as normal. Traps were checked, shelters were maintained. Supplies were counted and recounted, not out of fear, but habit. If anything, men worked more carefully without fully admitting why. The sky seemed lower somehow. Clouds stayed longer, thick and unmoving. Sunlight felt weaker, as if it was doing its best but lacked confidence. Shadows stretched early in the day, reminding everyone that daylight was shrinking faster than expected. Nights grew longer, and sleep became lighter. Cold crept in through every small opening. A fire that once lasted through the night now needed attention before morning. Men woke to feed flames, not alarmed, just aware. There was a quiet tension in the air. though no one named it. Naming things gives them power, and out here, power was already uneven. Better to observe than to declare. Some mountain men adjusted their routes. They chose lower valleys. They stayed closer to tree cover. They avoided open ground where wind could work without resistance. These were small decisions, the kind made without discussion. Others stayed where they were, trusting familiarity. The land they knew felt safer than moving into unknown ground. Both choices made sense. Neither came with guarantees. The early winter did not punish mistakes immediately. That, too, was misleading. It allowed just enough comfort to keep confidence intact. Just enough warmth to suggest that this season would behave like the others. But the wilderness does not owe consistency to anyone. Food became slightly harder to find. Not scarce, just less predictable. A successful day of trapping might be followed by several empty ones. Meals became smaller, eaten more slowly. Fat was saved. Nothing was wasted. Silence deepened. The land felt still in a way that was not restful. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. Even the usual sounds of winter felt muted, as if the world was listening to itself. Mountain men sat by their fires and thought less about tomorrow and more about the present moment. The crackle of wood, the warmth against their palms, the simple fact of being dry and breathing. There were no warnings posted, no messages sent, just subtle shifts that added up quietly. And perhaps the most unsettling sign was how normal everything still looked. Snow on trees, ice on water, cold air at dawn, all familiar, all expected. That familiarity made it easy to underestimate what was coming. The early signs did not shout. They whispered. They waited to see who was listening. And life on the edge of civilization continued, steady and routine-driven, even as the land prepared to test those routines more deeply than ever before. The fire burned, the wind moved through the trees, and winter, patient and precise, continued to settle in. At first, no one thought much of it. Snow had always come and gone, falling soft and quiet, then slowly disappearing under weak sunlight. That was the rhythm everyone knew. But this time the snow stayed. Day after day, it lay where it fell, pressed flat by cold, untouched by warmth. The first snowfall covered the ground gently, just enough to soften the sharp edges of the land. Footprints showed clearly, every step marked and remembered. Normally, those prints would fade in a day or two. This time, they remained frozen in place, like the land had decided to keep a record. More snow followed. Not heavy storms, just steady layers adding weight to weight. Trees bent slightly under it. Paths grew harder to recognize. Familiar ground began to look unfamiliar, even to men who had walked it for years. Sunlight still appeared, but it felt different. Thin, weak. It touched the snow but did not change it. Instead of melting, the surface hardened, forming a crust that cracked under boots and slowed every movement. Walking took more effort. Silence deepened. Mountain men adjusted again quietly. Travel became shorter and more deliberate. Camps were chosen closer to fuel and shelter. Routes that once took hours now took most of the day. Nothing dramatic happened, yet everything required more energy. Rivers froze earlier than expected, first at the edges, then across wider sections. Water that once moved freely now lay still, hidden under ice and snow. Crossing points became uncertain. A wrong step could mean soaked clothing, and soaked clothing in cold meant trouble. Animals grew scarce. Tracks appeared less often. When they did appear, they led away rather than through. Hunting took longer with fewer rewards. Food stores became more important, counted carefully and stretched slowly. Meals grew quieter. There was less to cook, less to clean, and less to waste. Fat was saved. Bones were cracked for what they could offer. Hunger was not constant yet, but it waited nearby. The land itself felt heavier. Snow absorbed sound, turning the wilderness into a muffled world. Wind moved through trees without much noise. Footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, echoing in the stillness. Shelters took on new importance. Gaps that once seemed harmless now let in cold that settled deep into muscles and joints. Repairs became daily work. A small leak or loose log was no longer an inconvenience. It was a problem that needed immediate attention. Fire became central to every decision. Where to camp, when to move, how long to stay awake. Wood that once lasted through the night now burned faster, fighting cold that refused to retreat. Men learned to sleep lightly, waking often to feed flames. Clothing stiffened. Buckskin froze hard overnight, softening only after long exposure to warmth. Putting on cold clothes became a slow, unpleasant ritual. Fingers protested. Movement came reluctantly. Despite all this, there was still a sense of waiting rather than fear. Winters had done this before, or so it seemed. Snow stayed sometimes. Cold lingered. Spring always came eventually, but something was missing. There were no breaks in the weather, no soft days, no brief melts that reset the land. The snow remained untouched, unchanged, building layer by layer. The ground disappeared beneath it, and with it many of the landmarks men relied on. Orientation became harder. Trails vanished. Familiar bends in rivers were hidden. Navigation depended more on memory and instinct than sight. Mistakes became easier to make. Time slowed. Days felt longer, even as daylight shortened. Tasks that once took minutes stretched into hours. Fatigue settled in quietly, not from one hard moment, but from many small efforts stacked together. At night, the cold pressed harder against shelters. Fires glowed, but their warmth felt limited, surrounded by an endless white that did not respond. The snow reflected firelight back into the darkness, making the world feel both close and vast at the same time. The realization came gradually. This snow was not going anywhere. It was not waiting for permission to melt. It had decided to stay. Mountain men did not speak this thought aloud, saying it would not help. Instead, they adapted further. Movement slowed. Risks were avoided. Energy was guarded. The first snow that never melted changed everything without announcing itself. It turned familiar land into something new. It rewrote the rules quietly, leaving no space for argument. And life continued, step by careful step, under a blanket of white that refused to lift. The cold did not arrive all at once. It deepened slowly, day by day, like something settling in. At first, it was only noticeable in the mornings, when breath felt thicker and fingers stayed stiff longer than usual. Then it lingered through the day. Finally, it stopped leaving at all. This was not ordinary cold. This was cold that seemed to remember nothing of warmth. a kind of cold that felt older than anyone living in it. Even the most experienced mountain men had trouble comparing it to past winters. Memory failed. Language failed too. There were no good words for it. Skin reacted first. Exposed flesh burned and then went numb within minutes. Fingers lost feeling so quickly that simple tasks took careful attention. Tying a strap, adjusting a trap, or handling metal became slow, deliberate work. Metal itself felt dangerous, stealing heat on contact like it had a purpose. Breathing changed. Each breath felt sharp, as if the air had edges. Lungs protested, especially during movement. Speaking out loud became rare, not because there was no one to talk to, but because talking let cold in deeper than silence ever did. The wilderness changed its behavior completely. Snow no longer softened underfoot. It stayed hard and dry, crunching with a sound that carried far in the still air. Trees cracked faintly in the night, not from wind, but from cold tightening their wood. Even the forest seemed uncomfortable. Fire struggled. Flames burned lower and faster, as if warmth itself was being pulled away. Wood that once gave steady heat now felt weak against the cold pressing in from all sides. Fires had to be fed constantly, watched closely, guarded like living companions. Water became a problem. Streams disappeared under ice thick enough to hold weight. Finding liquid water meant breaking through layers of frozen surface, a task that exposed hands and tools to brutal temperatures. Every moment spent doing this was calculated and limited. Clothing helped, but only to a point. Layers slowed the cold, but they could not stop it. Buckskin and fur froze stiff overnight, turning into armor that had to be warmed before it could be worn. Putting on frozen clothing was a test of patience and pain. Movement became careful and economical. No energy was wasted. Walking was slower, with shorter steps. Long rests were avoided because stopping meant cooling down too much. But moving too fast caused sweat, and sweat in this cold was dangerous. Balance mattered. Sleep was light and broken. Cold did not allow deep rest. Men woke often, adjusting position, feeding the fire, checking embers. Dreams faded quickly, replaced by awareness. Survival did not allow long escapes into sleep. The cold reached into thoughts as well. Decision-making slowed. Everything took more effort. Simple choices felt heavier. Not because of fear, but because the margin for error had narrowed. A small mistake could have lasting consequences. There was no comfort in routine anymore. What once felt manageable now demanded constant attention. Even experienced mountain men felt humbled. This was not a winter to test pride. It ignored experience and treated everyone the same. The landscape looked frozen in time. Nothing moved unless it had to. Animals were rarely seen. The world felt paused, held in place by cold that refused to ease. Sound traveled farther and silence felt deeper. Pain existed, but it was quiet. Numbness came first, then a dull ache that warned without shouting. Mountain men learned to watch their own bodies carefully, checking fingers and toes often, making sure sensation remained. Despite everything, there was no panic. Panic used too much energy. Instead, there was focus, narrow, steady focus. Keep warm, keep fire, keep food, keep moving only when necessary. This cold did not pass like others. It stayed constant, pressing down on days and nights alike. There were no mild moments, No relief hours. The cold beyond human memory settled into the land and stayed, and in that unrelenting stillness, men continued to exist, not because they were stronger than the cold, but because they learned how to live inside it. The mountain men quickly learned that survival depended as much on what they wore as on food or fire. Clothing was their armor against cold that seemed endless, and every layer, every stitch mattered. Buckskin was the foundation, soft, flexible, and warm. Fur linings from beavers, deer, or rabbits added insulation where it was needed most, turning simple garments into life-saving tools. Every coat, glove, and boot carried the marks of long winters, careful repairs, and hours spent preparing for the cold. Layering was essential. Mountain men built themselves like living snowmen, starting with soft base layers that hugged the skin and trapped warmth. Over them came thicker shirts, coats, and leggings. Boots were lined or wrapped in fur, gloves were layered, and hats and hoods covered heads and ears. Each piece had a purpose, and missing even one layer could make a harsh winter unbearable. Repairing clothing was part of daily life. Tears were stitched with sinew or leather strips, holes in boots patched to keep snow and water out. Every repair mattered. Patience became as important as strength or skill. Mistakes were inevitable, but each one taught lessons for the next cold day. Hats and gloves were practical. Hats kept ears warm, blocked wind, and shielded eyes from bright snow. Gloves had thin inner layers for dexterity and thick outer layers for insulation. Fingers were precious, and protecting them was essential. Mountain men treated clothing as a trusted companion, something they cared for and respected. They learned from the native tribes too, observing how they layered skins, used natural oils, and built boots for snow. Mountain men adopted these ideas and adapted them. Sometimes their experiments were awkward. Stiff coats, gloves that limited movement, but necessity always outweighed frustration. Each piece of clothing was a balance between warmth, flexibility, and protection. Small details mattered. Collars could be flipped up to block wind. Mittens were tied to prevent loss. Hoods were shaped to keep snow off the face. Buttons, ties, and seams were all functional. Every stitch could protect a finger or a toe. Nothing was left to chance. Even the best prepared men understood that clothing alone could not guarantee survival. The winter of 1836 was brutal, and every day required careful attention. But with proper layering, repaired garments, and respect for the cold, mountain men could endure the land and weather without unnecessary risk. Snow fell quietly outside, fires glowed in small shelters, and the clothing kept the men warm, dry, and moving. Each repaired coat, every layered glove, every fur-lined boot did its job, protecting them as they lived through the long, harsh days of winter. By the time winter of 1836 reached its full strength, the land felt empty. Animals were scarce, and familiar tracks disappeared under layers of snow. The rivers were frozen at the edges, and the forests were quiet, holding their breath. Mountain men had to rely on every skill they had learned to find food. Kuda had made survival harsh, and they knew every step, every decision mattered. Traps became the lifeline. Carefully set snares for rabbits, foxes, and beavers were checked daily. Some mornings brought small rewards, other days brought nothing at all. Mountain men worked patiently, knowing that a single mistake could mean hours of wasted effort. Every successful catch was precious, every loss a reminder of how unforgiving winter could be. Hunting required observation. Men watched the movement of birds, listened for sounds in the snow, and traced subtle signs left by animals. The tracks were faint, sometimes buried under new snow, but instinct and experience guided them. Each decision about where to check, which trail to follow, and how to move silently was calculated. Energy was precious, and wasted steps could be dangerous. When animals were hard to find, they turned to what the land still offered. Roots, bark, and dried berries provided small meals, enough to keep strength from failing completely. These were not tasty meals, but they kept men alive. Every bite was rationed carefully, eaten slowly, and never wasted. Fat, when available, was saved for long nights, burned for energy and warmth. Food had to be prepared carefully. Fires were small and controlled, used to cook meat, melt snow for water, and occasionally warm hands. Meat was preserved when possible, dried or smoked to last longer. Every tool mattered, knives kept sharp, traps maintained, arrows and lines checked. A broken instrument could turn a day of hunting into a wasted effort. Even with skill and patience, hunger was a constant companion. Mountain men ate when they could, but they understood the rhythm of the land. Some days provided, others did not. They moved slowly, conserving energy while waiting for the next opportunity. Kuda's creation was relentless, and endurance became the measure of survival. Every meal, no matter how small, brought quiet satisfaction. It was a reminder of skill, patience, and the ability to adapt. Each successful hunt or gathered root gave the men strength to continue through the long, frozen days. Food was not a comfort, it was necessity, and respecting it meant life could continue. The wilderness gave nothing freely. Men worked with the land, reading its signs, following its hidden rules, and relying on instincts sharpened by experience. Every catch, every small meal, was a victory earned through observation, patience, and careful action. Snow continued to fall, covering the land in white silence. Fires glowed in small shelters, and men ate what they could find. The routines of checking traps, gathering roots, and preserving meat filled the long days. Food was scarce, but every bite mattered, keeping life going quietly, steadily in the frozen wilderness. Fire was the most valuable thing a mountain man could have in the dead of winter. It gave warmth, comfort, and a sense of control in a world that seemed otherwise frozen and indifferent. Kuda had made the cold sharp and relentless, and fire was the thin line separating life from danger. Without it, frostbite, weakness, and exhaustion could claim a man in hours. Building a fire was an art in itself. Dry wood was scarce, often hidden beneath layers of snow or damp from ice. Men searched carefully, breaking through frozen branches or gathering driftwood along riverbanks. Each piece was chosen with care. Too small, and it would burn out quickly; too large, and it could smother smaller flames. Every spark mattered. Lighting the fire required patience. Flint and steel, the tools of choice, needed skill to produce sparks. Matches were rare, unreliable, and precious. A single successful strike could make the difference between a cold night and a night spent shivering and exposed. Every man learned to coax fire from the smallest kindling, treating it as both tool and companion. Once lit, the fire demanded attention. Flames had to be maintained, logs rotated, embers watched closely. Wind could extinguish it quickly, snow could smother it without warning, and a single careless moment could undo hours of effort. Mountain men stayed close, feeding the fire carefully, keeping it alive as long as they were awake. Fire was also a source of cooking. Frozen meat, dried roots, and any small catch were prepared over the flames. It brought sustenance and energy, making each bite more valuable. Water could be melted from ice or snow, turning it into life, giving liquid. Even the simplest meal gained warmth, flavor, and strength from the fire. Beyond survival, fire provided comfort. Its glow pushed back the darkness and quiet of the wilderness. Snowstorms and icy winds raged outside, but the flickering flames inside a shelter made the world seem smaller, manageable, and a little less harsh. Men sat beside it, hands warming, shoulders relaxed, even for a few moments, while the cold pressed outside. Mistakes with fire were dangerous. Sparks could ignite clothing, shelters, or stored supplies. Mountain men learned caution through experience, always aware that one misstep could turn safety into risk. Kuda's law of the land was clear: respect the fire, and it would protect you; neglect it, and the cold could claim everything. Fire shaped every decision. Where to camp, how long to stay awake, when to move, and how to prepare meals, all depended on its presence. A well-maintained fire allowed energy to be preserved, while a weak or absent fire forced every movement to be calculated, careful, and slow. It was life measured in warmth and light. Even on the coldest nights, the fire gave rhythm to survival. Sparks danced across logs, smoke curled toward the ceiling, and the soft crackle reminded men that they were still alive, still protected, still moving through the harsh winter. It was a small, steady heartbeat in the silence of frozen mountains. Snow fell silently outside, layering the land in white. Wind cut through trees, but the fire glowed steadily in small shelters. Men ate what they could, repaired clothing, and tended the flames. Each night, the fire performed its simple, vital work, keeping life alive, giving warmth, and allowing the mountain men to endure another frozen day. The land was frozen. Snow covered every trail, river edges were sealed with ice, and wind moved through the trees like a sharp knife. Mountain men had learned to read this world, to move with caution, and to respect its silence. Kuda had made survival hard, and every day was a test of patience, skill, and endurance. Camps were chosen carefully. Shelters needed protection from wind, access to firewood, and spots where snowdrifts would not bury the small homes overnight. Every cabin or lean became a small fortress against the cold. Mountain men reinforced them, sealing gaps with moss, bark, or extra fur. Each improvement meant more warmth, more safety, more life. Men settled into routines. Checking traps, maintaining fire, repairing clothing, and preparing meals filled the day. The cold dictated the schedule. Work was done slowly, deliberately, to conserve energy. Even small movements were calculated to keep body heat, avoid sweat, and prevent fatigue. Survival was a quiet, steady rhythm, Silence ruled the frozen world. Snow absorbed sound, and even small footsteps seemed loud. Mountain men moved carefully, listening for distant animals or the subtle cracking of ice. Every noise could be important. Even the wind was a guide. Its strength and direction helped decide when to move or when to stay close to the fire. Food remained scarce, but routines provided stability. Traps were checked regularly, small roots and bark gathered, and preserved meat rationed. Each meal was small but enough to maintain strength. Energy was precious, and men learned to stretch it carefully, guided by experience and patience. Fire continued to be central. Flames burned steadily in shelters, bringing warmth and light. Cooking, drying clothes, and melting snow for water all depended on the fire. It gave men a rhythm to follow, a small measure of control in a frozen, indifferent wilderness. The cold pressed in relentlessly. Fingers, toes, and exposed skin were vulnerable. Men checked themselves constantly, making sure no frostbite or injury went unnoticed. Every layer of clothing, every careful step, every warm meal, and every maintained fire was part of a delicate balance between life and danger. Days passed quietly, but the routine created a sense of order against chaos. Snow fell outside, wind swept across the mountains, but inside the shelters, men moved through their small tasks with care and focus. Work and rest were measured by need, not convenience. Mountain men had adapted. They settled against the frozen world, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, and finding life even in a harsh, silent winter. The land was still cold and unyielding, but experience, patience, and careful preparation allowed them to continue one measured step at a time. Shelters glowed with firelight, small meals were eaten quietly, and clothing kept men warm against the frozen night. The world outside remained still and white, but life continued inside, steady, patient, and carefully balanced against the cold. The mountains were silent. Snow covered every path, and the wind whispered softly through bare trees. Mountain men often found themselves alone, surrounded by endless white, with nothing but the cold and their own thoughts. Kuda had made this land harsh, and solitude was part of survival. Alone, every sound was sharper. The crackle of fire, the scraping of boots against wood, or the distant drip of melting snow became familiar companions. Silence was heavy, but it also offered space to observe, plan, and reflect. Men learned to listen to the world, to the land, and even to themselves. Isolation sharpened focus. Tasks were done with precision, repairing clothing, checking traps, maintaining fire. Even small mistakes could cost warmth, energy, or time. Being alone forced careful attention. Every movement had purpose, every action counted. Thoughts wandered to the past and future, but the cold demanded presence. Hunger, fatigue, and frost reminded men to act in the moment. Memory and experience guided decisions, while reflection quietly shaped patience. Solitude was both challenge and teacher. The mind noticed details that often went unseen in company. Animal tracks hidden under snow, subtle changes in wind, or the faint smell of wood smoke from a distant shelter all became important signs. Alone, every sense became sharper, every observation valuable. Fire offered company in the quiet. Flames danced, shadows shifted, and warmth radiated slowly through shelters. Men stared into the glow, feeling both comforted and aware of the cold beyond. The fire was steady, a small certainty in a world that gave none. Food was prepared carefully. Meals were small, eaten slowly, with gratitude for each bite. Hunger and scarcity were constant reminders that life required effort, patience, and respect for the land. Alone, every ration counted more, every preserved bite became part of survival. Thoughts often drifted to home, to friends, and to the life they had left behind. But the wilderness had its own rhythm. Men accepted it quietly, adapting their minds as carefully as their bodies. Solitude became a routine, a part of life in the frozen mountains. Evenings passed slowly. Snow fell gently outside, wind whispered, and fires glowed in small shelters. Mountain men moved methodically through tasks, aware of the cold pressing in, aware of the silence around them. Being alone was not easy, but it was manageable. Life in the mountains demanded awareness, patience, and quiet endurance. Alone with their thoughts, men worked, rested, and survived. Each day followed this rhythm: careful movement, small meals, tending the fire, and enduring the cold. Solitude became ordinary, a companion as constant as snow and wind. Shelters glowed, fires burned steadily, and mountain men carried on, living quietly, deliberately, and with careful attention to the frozen world around them. The mountains were a frozen maze. Trails disappeared under snow, rivers froze over, and landmarks vanished behind white drifts. Maps existed, but in a winter like 1836, they were only a guide. Mountain men had to rely on instinct, patience, and memory to move safely through the wilderness. Kuda had made the land unpredictable, and survival demanded more than ink on paper. Every step required attention. Rocks, fallen trees, and hidden ice made the terrain dangerous. Following instinct meant watching, listening, and feeling the land. Snow depth, wind direction, and animal trails became a language that only experience could read. Men learned to trust what their senses told them, rather than lines and symbols on a map. Instinct guided where to set traps, where to gather wood, and how to approach frozen rivers. Mountain men observed subtle signs: broken branches, faint footprints, the tilt of a tree. Each detail helped them make choices that maps could not. Experience sharpened instincts until survival became almost automatic. Sometimes instinct meant staying still. The cold could be unforgiving, and moving blindly risked frostbite, exhaustion, or injury. Knowing when to act and when to wait became as important as knowing which path to take. Patience was part of instinct, as vital as sight, hearing, or touch. Maps were occasionally useful, especially for longer routes, but snow often erased them. Trails vanished overnight, rivers changed with ice, and familiar terrain became unrecognizable. Mountain men learned not to rely solely on paper or memory. Trusting instinct was survival. Observing animals was a critical part of instinct. Birds, deer, and even small tracks told stories of nearby water, food, or shelter. Reading these signs required quiet attention, careful movement, and knowledge built over years. Mountain men respected the animals' signals, understanding that nature gave hints for those willing to see them. Fire, food, and clothing all became part of instinctual routines. Men knew how far they could travel when they needed to rest, and how to prepare for sudden storms. Every decision relied on a mix of knowledge and gut feeling. Kuda had given them tools, but instinct turned tools into life. The frozen wilderness offered no forgiveness for mistakes. One misstep could mean wet clothing, a lost trail, or exposure to cold. Mountain men learned to trust instincts honed over winters, feeling the rhythm of the land as much as seeing it. Movement became deliberate, purposeful, and careful. Even when maps failed, instinct guided them. The snow, the wind, the quiet of the mountains all became part of navigation. Step by careful step, men moved through the white world, surviving where reliance on maps alone would have failed. Snow continued to fall, covering the land in silence. Fires burned steadily, meals were prepared with care, and mountain men moved with attention and patience. Instinct, trained by experience, became as vital as any tool or weapon, helping them live through the harshest winter. The snow stretched endlessly, a quiet white world that seemed to cover every sign of life. Mountain men moved carefully, boots crunching against frozen layers, eyes scanning for movement. In this silent land, encounters, whether with animals, other men, or unexpected dangers, were sudden and often startling. Kuda had made the wilderness full of surprises, and each meeting demanded attention and caution. Animals were the most common encounters. Deer cautiously stepped through deep snow, their tracks sometimes leading to food or water. Rabbits dashed between drifts, foxes watched from a distance. Mountain men had to be patient observers, noting every movement while keeping still and silent. Even the smallest noise could scare away a possible meal. Predators were a constant concern. Wolves prowled near camps, their calls echoing across valleys. Mountain men learned to recognize the difference between curious observation and hunting behavior. Awareness, preparation, and quiet movement were essential to avoid danger. Fire, carefully tended, often provided protection and comfort in the nights when predators were near. Occasionally, other travelers appeared in the snow. Trappers, hunters, or occasional explorers crossed paths, often as surprised by the meeting as the mountain men themselves. Exchanges were brief, careful, and respectful. Supplies, advice, or directions might be shared, but every interaction carried a subtle awareness of the cold, the terrain, and the fragility of survival. Encounters sometimes brought challenges. A branch hidden under snow could send a man falling. A frozen river crossing could shift unexpectedly, and weather could change in minutes. Mountain men moved slowly and deliberately, learning to trust their senses and instincts. Every step had to be measured, every decision careful. Snowstorms transformed encounters into tests of endurance. Visibility dropped, sounds muffled, and familiar landmarks disappeared. Even the wind became an opponent, pushing men off balance or covering trails. In these moments, survival relied on experience, instinct, and the small routines that had become part of daily life, checking clothing, feeding the fire, and conserving energy. Interactions with the environment itself were encounters too. Ice cracking underfoot, trees bending under snow, and hidden crevices all reminded mountain men that the land could be dangerous even when silent. Every observation, every small movement mattered. Awareness became second nature. Despite the harshness, there were quiet rewards. Tracks of deer or rabbits offered hope. A distant howl reminded men that the wilderness was alive, and the soft snowfall created moments of strange beauty. Encounters in the snow were unpredictable, but they shaped survival, teaching caution, observation, and patience. Mountain men continued their routines in this white world. Fires glowed, meals were prepared, traps were checked, and clothing was adjusted against the cold. Encounters, big or small, expected or sudden, were part of life in the mountains. They were reminders of the land's power, its challenges, and its quiet rules. Snow fell steadily outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the mountain men moved carefully through the frozen world. Life continued, measured, deliberate, and aware, guided by observation and respect for the land around them. The winter of 1836 was harsh, but mountain men were not alone in their understanding of the land. Native tribes had lived in these mountains for generations, and their knowledge of survival became invaluable. Kuda had given the land its challenges, but the wisdom of those who had walked it for centuries offered guidance and insight. Observation was the first lesson. Mountain men learned to watch the behavior of animals, the direction of winds, and the subtle signs of approaching storms. Native hunters and trappers showed them how to read the land as a living map, noticing details invisible to the untrained eye. Every track, broken branch, or bent tree had meaning. Hunting and trapping techniques were shared and adapted. Natives demonstrated how to set traps for rabbits, foxes, and beavers efficiently. They taught which paths animals preferred, how to move silently through deep snow, and how to predict their movements. Mountain men adopted these methods, learning to combine their own experience with time-tested strategies. Clothing and shelter techniques were another area of guidance. Native knowledge of layered skins, insulated boots, and fur-lined garments helped mountain men survive the cold. Shelters built with careful attention to wind, snowdrifts, and fire placement became more effective. These lessons turned ordinary clothing and cabins into reliable defenses against the harsh winter. Food preservation was taught with patience. Natives showed how to smoke meat, dry fish, and store fat to last long months. Even small techniques like choosing the right part of a tree for firewood or identifying edible roots made survival easier. Every lesson was practical and life-saving. Navigation through the frozen mountains relied heavily on this shared knowledge. Mountain men learned to identify landmarks even under snow, use subtle changes in the terrain to maintain direction, and avoid dangerous areas. The mountains could be confusing and disorienting, but guidance from those who had lived there made travel more manageable. Even small behaviors mattered. Mountain men learned to respect the land, to move quietly, and to leave minimal traces. These lessons, passed down through native knowledge, reinforced the importance of patience and observation. Kuda had made the winter harsh, but understanding it became a skill. Over time, the teachings became instinct. Mountain men no longer needed constant instruction. The land itself, its animals, and its signs became clear thanks to lessons shared by those who had survived it for generations. Experience combined with knowledge gave men confidence in the frozen world. The winter remained unyielding, But native knowledge helped shape survival. Traps, fires, clothing, and movement were guided by these lessons. Mountain men moved more carefully, hunted more successfully, and endured longer than they could have on instinct alone. Snow fell steadily outside, covering the mountains in white silence. Inside cabins, fires glowed warmly, clothing kept men safe, and preserved food provided strength. The knowledge shared across generations had become part of daily life, quietly guiding men through the frozen world without drawing attention to itself. The winter of 1836 tested more than just skill and preparation. Illness and injury were constant threats, and mountain men had to endure with patience and careful attention. Kuda had made survival harsh, and every minor cut, bruise, or sickness could become dangerous in the frozen wilderness. Frostbite was a frequent danger. Fingers, toes, and exposed skin could turn numb quickly, and men learned to check themselves constantly. Early signs were treated immediately, rubbing and warming to prevent further damage. Clothing, fires, and movement were all used to protect vulnerable parts of the body. Cuts, scrapes, and broken branches could also become serious. Mountain men cleaned wounds with water, snow, or alcohol when available. Bandages were made from strips of cloth or leather. Every small injury required attention, because infection or freezing temperatures could make even minor problems life-threatening. Illness often came from fatigue or exposure. Cold nights, long days, and limited food could weaken the body, making men more vulnerable to fever, coughs, or stomach problems. Rest was essential, and fire became not just warmth but a tool to recover energy. Men learned to pace themselves, listening to their bodies to survive. Endurance was as much mental as physical. Days were long, isolated, and silent, and the weight of injury or sickness could make the wilderness feel heavier. Men learned to focus on small tasks, checking a trap, stirring a fire, or repairing clothing. Every action became a way to keep control and keep moving forward. Experience shaped solutions. Natural remedies, like herbal teas or poultices, were used when available. Small adjustments in routine, moving more slowly, keeping dry, or layering clothing differently, helped prevent worsening conditions. Kuda's law of the land required careful attention to every detail. Even minor injuries demanded patience. A twisted ankle, a sore wrist, or frostbitten fingers slowed movement and required careful adaptation. Mountain men adjusted their tasks, conserved energy, and relied on training to continue daily routines without risking more harm. Food, fire, and shelter remained essential to endurance. Every small meal replenished energy, every maintained fire provided warmth, and clothing protected against the cold. These small, consistent efforts became a buffer against illness and injury, allowing men to survive longer in harsh conditions. The winter continued without mercy, but men endured. Every repaired coat, every checked trap, and every cautious step helped them remain alive, even as their bodies faced the constant pressure of cold, fatigue, and injury. Snow fell outside, winds howled across the mountains, and mountain men moved through the frozen world carefully, treating every injury and sickness with patience and skill. Life continued quietly, steadily, and with endurance at its core, a daily battle won one small step at a time. The nights in the winter of 1836 were long, silent, and unending. Snow covered the mountains, and the darkness seemed to stretch for hours without pause. Mountain men learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the rhythm of their tasks, the glow of fires, and the slow, quiet passing of the hours. Kuda had made the nights cold and still, and surviving them required patience and care. Fires were essential companions. Flames glowed in small shelters, giving warmth to hands, feet, and bodies chilled by the day. The crackle of wood and the gentle hiss of melting snow created a quiet rhythm, a heartbeat in the frozen night. Men moved close to the warmth, adjusting clothing and blankets to preserve heat through the long hours. Meals were small but important. Leftover meat, preserved roots, and dried berries were eaten slowly. Energy was precious, and even a few bites could make the difference between comfort and suffering. Every ration was treated with care, eaten with awareness of the long night ahead. Silence dominated outside. The wind whispered through trees, snow fell softly on rooftops, and the mountains seemed paused in a frozen stillness. Mountain men listened, learned the rhythm of the wilderness, and allowed the quiet to guide their movements. Even small sounds, a falling branch or distant animal, could catch attention immediately. Tasks were deliberate. Checking traps, mending clothing, and tending the fire filled the night hours. Each action was slow and careful, conserving energy while ensuring survival. Men moved methodically, aware that haste could lead to mistakes, injury, or lost warmth. Cold was constant. Fingers, toes, and exposed skin were vulnerable, even inside shelters. Layering clothing, rotating logs in the fire, and moving with purpose became a nightly routine. Every small adjustment helped prevent frostbite and maintain comfort. The night was also a test of endurance. Hours stretched and energy waned, but men adapted. They measured progress not by the clock, but by completed tasks, preserved warmth, and the small victories of staying alive through another long stretch of darkness. Observing the world through snow, covered windows, or tent flaps, mountain men noticed subtle changes. Moonlight reflecting off drifts, faint animal tracks, or the glint of ice in the distance were small signs of life. Each observation reminded them that the wilderness was alive, even in the deepest night. The long nights demanded focus, patience, and quiet action. Every task, every step, and every breath became part of a careful rhythm. Fire, clothing, food, and vigilance worked together, helping men endure the hours when the world outside was frozen and still. Snow continued to fall quietly, covering mountains in white, while inside small shelters, fires glowed and mountain men moved carefully through the night. Life continued steadily, with warmth, routine, and careful attention carrying them safely through the longest nights. The winter of 1836 pressed on, and each day felt long, cold, and uncertain. Mountain men had learned that survival was not only about skill, food, or fire, it was also about hope. Every morning, waking to frozen landscapes, they made the quiet decision to keep moving, to keep working, and to keep enduring. Kuda had made the world harsh, and holding on required more than strength. It required determination. Each day began with careful checks. Clothing was adjusted, fires stoked, and shelters inspected. Traps were checked, meals prepared, and water melted from ice. Even small tasks carried significance, providing both sustenance and a sense of purpose. Hope was built through action, one small task at a time. Encounters with scarcity tested men constantly. Animals were harder to find. Food was limited, and the wind seemed relentless. Hunger and cold were constant companions. But mountain men learned to measure progress not by abundance, but by survival itself. Every small success became a reason to continue. The mind became a tool as much as the body. Focus, patience, and careful observation allowed men to stretch limited resources, anticipate dangers, and avoid mistakes. Each decision, no matter how small, became a thread holding life together in the white wilderness. Fire remained central. Its warmth, its glow, and its crackle reminded men that effort brought results. Preparing meals, repairing clothing, and tending flames became acts of hope in themselves, small daily victories against a world that gave nothing freely. Solitude intensified awareness. Long stretches alone in cabins or tents made every action deliberate. Thoughts were quiet, but attention to survival sharpened senses. Observing the wind, listening for distant animals, and watching snow patterns became part of the rhythm of hope, guiding men through another frozen day. Endurance was tested continuously. Frostbite, fatigue, and cold pressed relentlessly, but hope gave focus to action. Men moved carefully, prepared meals, adjusted clothing, and maintained fire. Each action reinforced their survival, quietly reminding them that effort mattered even when results were uncertain. Even small glimpses of progress offered encouragement. Tracks in the snow, successful catches, or a fire that held through the night all reminded men that life continued. Hope was not loud or dramatic, it was a quiet, steady force, nurtured through careful attention and consistent effort. Snow fell steadily, covering the mountains in white silence. Fires glowed in small shelters, clothing kept bodies warm, and preserved food provided energy. Mountain men moved through the frozen world, making hope a daily decision, living steadily, deliberately, and carefully through the unyielding winter. After months of frozen silence, small changes began to appear. Snow softened in places, ice at the edges of rivers started to crack, and the wind, though still cold, carried a faint warmth. Mountain men noticed these signs carefully, aware that life continued and seasons were slowly shifting. Cuda had made the winter long and harsh, but even the frozen world had rhythms that could be read. Rivers that had been solid and treacherous now whispered beneath thin layers of ice. Men watched the movement closely, marking where it was safe to gather water or travel. Each small thaw became a reminder of change, of life beneath the snow, and of opportunities slowly returning to the land. Snowdrifts became easier to traverse. Paths that had been buried under months of accumulation began to reappear. Mountain men moved more confidently, though still carefully, adjusting routines to take advantage of lighter work. Every step on softening ground felt like progress, a quiet reward for enduring the long months. Food sources also began to reemerge. Tracks of deer, rabbits, and other animals became visible again. Streams that had been frozen solid offered small fish in patches of open water. Mountain men set traps and gathered resources, grateful for even small increases in availability. Survival became slightly less strenuous, though vigilance remained necessary. Fires were still important, but nights became slightly shorter and the cold less severe. Men could stretch small tasks with more energy, repairing shelters, tending clothing, and checking traps without feeling the same extreme exhaustion. The thaw brought small relief, not comfort, but life slowly returned to rhythm. Even with the first signs of thaw, caution remained essential. Ice could still break unexpectedly, snowbanks could collapse, and storms could return at any moment. Mountain men maintained routines carefully, aware that the frozen world was not yet finished testing them. Every observation, every measured step, was part of steady survival. Small signs of life brought quiet hope. Buds on branches, distant bird calls, and moving water reminded men that the wilderness was awakening again. These subtle changes marked the end of long endurance and the slow beginning of easier days. Each observation was recorded in memory, informing decisions and guiding movement. Snow continued to fall lightly in some areas, but patches of open ground hinted at spring. Fires glowed in shelters, clothing continued to protect against cold, and food, though still rationed carefully, became a little easier to gather. Mountain men adjusted, moving with patience and care, watching the thaw reshape the world around them. The frozen mountains were not completely tamed, but the first signs of thaw meant the end of the harshest stretch. Life continued, cautiously, steadily, and with measured effort. The land began to breathe again, and the men, shaped by months of endurance, continued living through it, carefully observing every small change. The snow began to thin, and the world slowly shifted. Mountain men stepped carefully across softer ground, boots crunching through melting drifts. Months of endurance had shaped every movement, every action, and every decision. Kuda had made the winter long and relentless, but step by step, the frozen hold on the land began to loosen. Rivers, once solid, flowed in quiet, uneven currents. Mountain men observed the thaw closely, finding safe places to cross, gathering water, and noting the changes in the terrain. The softening landscape required attention, but it also allowed movement with less effort than the deep winter had demanded. Paths that had been buried under snow for weeks reappeared. Trails through the forest became visible again, marked by the tracks of animals and previous travelers. Mountain men followed these signs carefully, remembering the lessons learned during months of isolation. Each step was measured, cautious, and deliberate. Food became more accessible. Deer and rabbits moved freely, streams provided small fish, and roots or early shoots appeared where snow receded. Traps were checked with renewed purpose, and every small success brought energy back to weary bodies. Survival was still careful work, but the land began to offer more than just challenge. Fires remained central to daily life, but the nights were shorter and slightly warmer. Shelters no longer needed the constant maintenance required during the harshest months. Men could rest with less fear, move with slightly less strain, and stretch energy for longer periods. Every small improvement in conditions made life easier. Step by step, awareness of the land remained critical. Snow could still hide dangers, ice could remain under patches of water, and sudden cold snaps were possible. Mountain men continued routines with careful attention, checking clothing, maintaining warmth, and ensuring food and water were available. The lessons of endurance remained, even as the environment softened. Movement became gradual freedom. The long, silent months of winter had taught caution, patience, and careful observation. Now, walking through partially thawed landscapes, mountain men applied all they had learned, moving with experience guiding each footfall. Every step out of winter was deliberate and controlled. Small signs of life, birds calling, flowing water, and the first patches of green reminded men that the wilderness was changing. The frozen grip loosened, but survival still required skill, respect, and careful attention. Each day became a small victory, each step forward a quiet accomplishment earned through months of hardship. Snow fell lightly at times, covering parts of the mountains, but the overall landscape shifted towards spring. Fires glowed in small shelters, food was gathered steadily, and mountain men moved across the thawing land with care and confidence. Life continued deliberately, measured and observant, as they walked slowly out of the harsh winter that had tested them for so long. The snow slowly melted, leaving the mountains and valleys scarred but alive. Trails were still marked by deep drifts and broken branches, rivers ran full with melted ice, and patches of bare ground appeared where snow had once held firm. Mountain men walked carefully, observing the land that had tested them for months. Kuda had made the winter harsh, but the world endured, and so did they. Shelters that had been reinforced through months of storms now stood resilient. Cabins, lean tows, and simple huts showed the marks of survival, patched roofs, tightened walls, and repaired floors. Every repair, every adjustment, was a quiet record of the long months spent living against the cold. Clothing carried stories as well. Boots, gloves, and coats were worn, stitched, and patched countless times. Each layer told of frost, wind, and snowstorms endured. Mountain men examined their garments carefully, mending what could be mended, knowing these tools would still be essential for future seasons. Traps cleared paths, and fire sites marked the land. Even as the snow retreated, the work of survival remained visible. Rabbit and fox tracks led to food. Lines of rocks or small clearings indicated places of rest, and the faint smoke of old fires hinted at long nights of endurance. Every trace told a story of persistence. Bodies carried the memory of winter too. Muscles were hardened by movement through snow, hands calloused from work, and minds sharpened by long hours of observation. Mountain men had learned patience, careful attention, and resilience. Every scar, every mark, every habit was part of what winter had left behind. The land offered small rewards. Streams that had been frozen now flowed with fish, early shoots appeared among the melting snow, and birds returned to the trees. Mountain men observed these signs with quiet focus, knowing that life was beginning again and that the lessons of winter could guide them forward. Despite relief, vigilance remained. Snow patches could hide hazards, rivers were still unpredictable, and sudden storms could arrive unexpectedly. Men continued routines, checking clothing, maintaining tools, and preparing food. Survival was not over, but the harshest months were behind them. Every shelter, every fire, Every trap and tool now stood as evidence of skill, patience, and endurance. The mountains were still wild and challenging, but the traces of the winter showed what could be overcome. The long months had left a record of human resilience, quietly written into the land and the lives of those who endured it. Mountain men moved through the thawing landscape, observing the world around them carefully. Snow retreated, rivers flowed, and life slowly returned. The winter of 1836 had been harsh, demanding, and relentless, but it left behind survival strength and experience. Every careful step, every prepared meal, and every small victory was now part of the story written into the mountains.